A stepfather has admitted to getting his 11-year-old stepdaughter pregnant, and now the mother and grandmother of the child are also facing charges. Hi, my name is Matthew Phifer. I'm a therapist who analyzes the behavior behind high-profile true crime cases. In this video, we're going to break down the case of Dustin and Sheree Walker and Michelle Justice. This is the type of content that you enjoy. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing. Let's watch this next video together. I'll give you my breakdown afterwards, but for now, let's get into it.
It is truly hard to find any words for this story. The way a stepfather appears to have handled the allegations that he faced does tell you a lot. This is that stepfather. His name is Dustin Walker, and he just admitted guilt to the kind of charges that as a human being, it's hard to fathom. This is video of when he made a court appearance in Oklahoma per KJRH TV. This story taking place about an hour away from Tulsa. Now, the charges that Walker faced: felony sexual abuse of a child under the age of 12 and 6 felony counts of child neglect. And he has pleaded guilty to all of them. But this guilty plea does not come as part of a plea deal. And there's still some questions about how this case is going to play out. We're going to talk about that and what his punishment may be in just a moment. Now, even though it might be fair to say that there is not a punishment steep enough for what law enforcement found, this man did. Now, he's not the only one who faced charges in this case. You have Walker's wife, her name is Sheree, and Sheree's mom, who's the victim's grandmother, and the newborn baby's great-grandmother. The two of them are also facing charges in this case. Now, before we break down what could happen to them, what their cases look like right now, I want to go back and lay out the disturbing details for you in this one. This story, at least for those on the outside and for law enforcement, it started on August 16th inside this home in Muscogee, Oklahoma, which is about an hour away from Tulsa. According to local media, the district attorney prosecuting this case said inside that home, an 11-year-old girl gave birth to a full-term baby on that day. Now, authorities say the 11-year-old victim, she hadn't seen a doctor in more than a year. And you just think about this young girl, what she went through, and the pregnancy that she had to go through. And she went through it out of the sight of medical professionals. She received no medical care, according to law enforcement. This girl wasn't enrolled in school either, so she was out of the sight of authority figures that potentially could have done something to help. Now, when law enforcement realized what had happened, and they were trying to piece together how it could happen, they spoke to the girl's parents. So you have her mom, Sheree, and then you have the victim's stepdad, Dustin Walker. Now, initially, the Walkers told police that they were shocked that the girl gave birth, that they claimed that they had no idea that the 11-year-old girl was pregnant. Let's talk about that for a second, because the DA told local media that, frankly, it just seemed like a lie. The DA said the girl was, quote, petite, so at full term, an 11-year-old being pregnant, it would be obvious. Now, Dustin was 34 years old at the time of the arrest. The girl's mom was 33. Now, when we found the Facebook pages for the Walkers, we found pictures showing them holding young children. And neighbors told local media in Tulsa that 6 children lived inside that house along with multiple dogs and cats. And to make matters worse, the neighbors claimed that the house with all those people inside did not have running water for as long as 3 years leading up to the uncovering of this house of horror and the alleged abuse that took place inside. Now, here's how the investigation went down to our understanding. Police have this 11-year-old girl who gave birth. They have a baby, and they have the horrible conditions inside the home. And on top of that, you have the Walkers who are claiming they have no idea how any of this could happen. Now, at first, the Walkers were arrested, and their initial charges, 6 counts of child neglect, 1 for each child inside of the home. That baby, though, was tested for DNA, and that is when this sad and sick case took a major step forward, because the DNA came back, and it showed reportedly with a 99% certainty that Dustin Walker was the father. And at that point, a charge of sexual abuse of a child under the age of 12 was added to his case. As far as Sheree Walker, Dustin's wife, she was charged with enabling sexual abuse. Sheree Walker did not appear to have a criminal record prior to this, but Dustin did. And we found 2 cases that involved him. You have one in 2020 where he was charged with firing a gun inside his home. And that case appears to have ended in him paying a fine. Records show that the case was sent to collections. Then in 2023, he was charged with domestic assault and battery in the presence of a minor. That case was dismissed. Now, clearly the health and safety of the 11-year-old victim and the baby, as well as the other children who were living inside that home with the Walkers, is so important to focus on in this case. In the wake of the Walker's arrest, the district attorney said the 11-year-old victim was traumatized and she had to give birth inside this home that reportedly did not have running water, and she did so without medical care. Now, on top of that, this girl hadn't seen a doctor in more than a year, and she had not been in school either. And you just think of those places, not just as places where you can get medical care, but those are places where people could have intervened. They could have stepped in and helped. But instead, this girl was kept out of sight, according to authorities. Now, one of the people accused of aiding the abuse and the horrific situation is Sheree's mom, the victim's grandmother and that newborn's great-grandmother, biologically. Her name is Michelle Justice. Now, on the day this story came to light, there was a reporter with KJRH-TV in Tulsa. This reporter went to the neighborhood just trying to gather information to tell this story and what happened. And she reported that there was a woman taking videos of her from across the street. She then approached that woman on her way out of the neighborhood, and this is what the woman told her.
We didn't know this was happening. None of us.
How do you think your granddaughter got pregnant?
She keeps telling us that it was the little 12-year-old.
Now, the woman you just heard speaking there, that is Michelle Justice. Here's her mugshot. And according to law enforcement, what you just heard her say to the reporter was a lie. Justice was arrested and charged with 6 counts of child neglect. It's believed a total of 6 children, again, lived inside that house, including the 11-year-old girl. Justice is reportedly that 11-year-old's grandmother, and she reportedly also lived in the home where that child gave birth. In fact, she's been accused of allegedly witnessing the birth. Now, at the time of this recording, Sheree Walker and Michelle Justice, they are still facing those charges. Their cases are ongoing. As far as Dustin Walker, he entered what's called a blind plea to these charges. And that means there's no plea deal in place, but he is entering pleas of guilty to all charges. Now it is up to the court to decide what his punishment will be. Previously, the DA told media outlets that Dustin could spend the rest of his life in prison based on these charges. His sentencing is set for June 18th. There's a pre-sentence investigation that will take place before that. Now, the charges he's pleading guilty to are also what are considered 85% crimes in Oklahoma, which means whatever his sentence is, he will have to serve at least 85% of it. Walker's defense attorney told KJRH-TV that it's not typical for him to advise a client to enter a blind plea, but in this situation, he, quote, didn't feel like there was one that we could get that would be useful or helpful in any way. And he described the potential punishment as, quote, wide open. Joining us now to talk more about this case is practice professor of law at Temple University and former child abuse and sex crimes prosecutor Marian Bracha. Always great to have you here on Law and Crime. I know this story is just, it's incredibly difficult. What does it tell you that Dustin Walker enters a blind plea to all the charges that he's facing in this case?
Well, I think he probably received some advice from counsel that the prosecution's case was evidentiarily very strong. I think as we talked about when we first covered this case, it was entirely possible, or it would have been entirely possible, to proceed to trial and to try this entire case and present the entirety of the state's evidence against the defendant without live testimony. It very well could have been proven to the state's burden beyond a reasonable doubt, based on the medical records of the pregnancy and the birth and delivery, and the DNA results that match the defendant's DNA to the child who was born of this abuse. And so I think he recognized the strength of the prosecution's case against him, and is likely throwing himself at the mercy of the court and hoping for something less than a life sentence.
Yeah, what does a defendant get? I mean, when you're doing a blind plea as opposed to saying, I'm just going to try my hand at a trial, and in this case, it feels like the trial might have been, here's the DNA results, there it is. I mean, what does he get out of it if by just entering a blind plea?
I think what he gets out of it is, or at least what he's likely hoping to get out of it, is mercy from the court, is a recognition that he has spared the victim having to testify or at least being involved in the court process at all, knowing that there is a criminal prosecution happening. It has spared her being contacted by investigators, by prosecutors, by other court personnel, asking if she would be inclined to give what's known as a victim impact statement. It spares the court system the resources and the time to go to a trial, which of course is still his constitutional right. But it's in recognition of the fact that those are costly and time-consuming endeavors to bring a defendant to trial. And so likely what he is thinking is that I am giving up these rights, and I hope that my sentencing judge will recognize that I could have exercised these rights and would have been constitutionally within my rights to demand a trial. But I am not, and I have not. And for that, could some mercy be shown in terms of, I don't think anyone's expecting leniency in this case. I don't think anyone's expecting, a slap on the wrist or any kind of probationary sentence. But in all likelihood, he's hoping for less than a life sentence and would be essentially bargaining his constitutional rights against that hope.
What goes into a judge, the decision now? So he enters the blind plea. I know he's going to be sentenced. I think it's June 18th is the date. And they said there was going to be a pre-sentence investigation that goes on. Like, what's the process between he's entered this plea, he's pleading guilty, to then the moment the judge says, this is what your sentence is going to be?
Sure. So it varies state by state, but a pre-sentence investigation is typically a very intensive process by which an assigned investigator who's appointed by the court system does an intensive interview with the defendant himself to find out about a biographical history, psychological history, family history, sociological history, and also can conduct some interviews of people closest to the defendant. So in all likelihood, they wouldn't be going to his wife because I'm sure, as we'll talk about, she has a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent because of the charges that she's facing currently, but they could certainly speak with other family members, his parents, siblings, people who know him in the community to find out about him as a person, to find out about his involvement in the community, his background, his upbringing. In certain states, there are also evaluations by psychologists or psychiatrists. And in this particular case, that will likely happen because there are reporting requirements that are attendant to these certain sexual offenses. And of course, I'm referring to Megan's Law registration. And so many states will require an evaluation by what's known as the Sex Offender Assessment Board. In Pennsylvania, that's what we call it. I'm fairly certain that there are analogous boards in the state of Oklahoma that would do an evaluation like that. And depending on the circumstances and depending even on what the pre-sentence investigation reveals, there might be an order for even a drug and alcohol or other substance abuse evaluation to see if those services might be necessary or might be recommended during the term of incarceration if that were to be imposed.
And when it comes to the two other cases that are playing out, but specifically Sheree Walker, who is facing this charge of enabling the abuse that Dustin Walker is pleading guilty. And I'm sure for her defense attorney, it might not be a surprise that it went this way. Like, once the news came out about the DNA, it kind of shows what happened inside of the home. But how does the fact that this is now somewhat final with a guilty plea impact how her case could go moving forward?
Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, I actually don't think it has much of an impact on the other defendants' cases, either one of them, frankly, because both of them are. Notice there's, as far as I know, there's no conspiracy charge. So there's no allegation from the state that this was action in concert, that there was some meeting of the minds or some agreement beforehand that this abuse, that this activity was going to take place. So one is not necessarily dependent on the other. But I think with both of the defendants that remain, the mother and the grandmother, there are viable motions from their defense attorneys to say, listen, this case, our case has nothing to do with that defendant who pled guilty. he had guilty mind and recognized the wrongfulness of his actions, and also recognized the evidentiary strength of the prosecution's case against him. That was his decision to make. That has no bearing on the guilt or not guilt of our client. So we're not even going to go there. We're not going to mention the stepfather's case. We're not going to mention the fact that he pled guilty or whatever potential penalty he might be facing. And we're going to say that the state still has a burden. The state still has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was enabling happening, that this mother knew of the abuse that was happening, and it's a specific intent crime, that she had this knowledge and it intended to allow this abuse to occur. And so to that extent, you need to prove all of these separate elements of this separate charge against her beyond a reasonable doubt, without any regard to what that other defendant, what the stepfather knew, should have known, or did do and pled guilty to. So I do see them as separate entities, and I don't think one would influence the other very much.
And when you look at going back to Dustin Walker and the crimes that he is pleading guilty to, they're considered 85% crimes. And that would mean that he would have to serve at least 85%. Like, what goes into, once he's sentenced, maybe it's the rest of his life, maybe it's just a very long period of time. What goes into how long he actually will have to serve time?
Sure. So the sentencing judge will impose a sentence. And so, again, states vary. Some states will impose a flat sentence, meaning, it's 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or whatever the definite term of incarceration is. Other states will give a range. They'll say, 3 to 6 years or 15 to 30 years. I'm just giving you arbitrary numbers as an example. And in those states that give a range, the minimum has to be met. So that first number, that 3 of the 3 to 6, or that 15 of the 15 to 30. Now, even in states that will give a range of sentencing, typically that 85%, if there is such a thing as an 85% rule in those states, it would be 85% of the max. And so that could mean that if Dustin Walker is sentenced to a 20-year flat sentence, it would be 85% of those 20 years. If he's sentenced to a range, if Oklahoma is a state where they impose a ranged sentence, 15 to 30 years, for instance, it would typically be an 85% calculation of whatever the maximum sentence is. So it would almost certainly go beyond the minimum.
The charges, of course, like what he's done, what he's pleading guilty to. I mean, it's so difficult to just comprehend it. I think it's disgusting and sad. Come the day of his sentencing, and if he gives the greatest, stands up and is apologetic and says everything that someone can say in those moments when they have the opportunity to address the court, like, does any of that ever have an impact on a judge? Could it have an impact on a judge and how things go in that moment, that day, when you're given the opportunity to speak?
Absolutely. And I think that any judge in this country wouldn't be upholding their oath if they didn't fully consider a defendant's own allocution, meaning that the defendant gets to speak in his own defense or in his own right at a sentencing proceeding. So I think that it is the judge's responsibility to listen and to consider a defendant's admission or recognition of guilt, and assumption of responsibility and accountability, whether or not that is compelling enough to migrate a sentence downward, meaning to give a lesser term than a judge would have otherwise imposed. I don't know, but that's why we give our judges the trust from the community, and they are in those positions of authority to do what the record and what the circumstances and what their community deems appropriate in any particular case. And so it's entirely possible that a defendant's allocution could sway a judge. It's also entirely possible that a defendant's allocution could hurt their case and could end up making the sentence even stiffer or higher. So it really all depends.
And when it comes to the victim in this case, and for her to be so young, and then you also have this child, I mean, how does the system, when it comes to where they live, and I'm not sure what the family situation is beyond, the mom, the stepdad, and of course the grandmother facing the charges, but it seems like a unique situation where you have, someone still a newborn, and then you have someone who's incredibly young and still is a child as well. Like, how does the system handle that, and where they live, and what happens to them?
It is a potentially very, very sad story. I don't want to write the ending to this story before there is one. But this has the makings of a potentially very sad story. So I would hope that there are social workers involved. I would hope that there are child wraparound services involved that can help this child heal both as a child and as a survivor of this assault, and also give her the tools if she is in a position to wield them, to be a parent if that is the direction she's taking her life, if she has opted to be a parent and be involved in this child's life. Whatever happens, I hope that they both, the victim and her child, I hope that they both have the supports they need to heal and to thrive physically, mentally, and emotionally.
And then just lastly, on the neglect charges, Dustin Walker is pleading guilty to 6 of those. And then Sheree Walker is facing those charges. And then Michelle Justice, she is facing the felony neglect charges as well. There were reports at the house where these people were living, did not have running water. On one hand, I know that people, everybody lives differently. Everybody has different situations. But in terms of the law, what is the bar for this is neglect, especially in cases involving minors?
Yeah. So again, it varies by state, and it's going to vary by community. And so most of our statutes and most of our legal standards are written to what's known as the reasonable person standard. So would a reasonable person in this defendant's position, living in this defendant's community, raising children in these circumstances, would that reasonable person who's, not coming from a completely different socioeconomic class, not coming from a completely different society, if you will, with different supports, we're talking about someone in this defendant's position, would they deem it reasonable to subject a child to these living conditions, or to deprive a child of the medical care, of the food, of the running water, of the other utilities and accommodations that they need? Would that person in that position deem it reasonable to raise a child or subject a child to those conditions? And if the answer is no, and if the evidence is compelling and met and proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then those elements would arguably be met, and a conviction could ensue.
All right, welcome back. So there is a lot going on in this case. Obviously, we have socioeconomic stuff. We have abuse going on. We have different aspects of different children that are living here. Even though we're talking about an 11-year-old who has been impregnated by an adult, the other children have experienced abuse and neglect just by witnessing some of these things, the stories of them not having running water. So this is just a really sad story overall. And we have to take a look at how the adults in this situation, we're talking about 3 different adults, how they have all failed them. 3 different adults. We have a couple of different generations. We have people, neighbors that have witnessed things, kids coming in and out. We have a school system that possibly failed here as well. I'm not sure if they reported the fact that the child had not been coming to school. So there's a lot going on, but 3 things that stood out to me that I want to talk about from my perspective. Number 1 is the no medical care and no school. And this is obvious. This was an obvious way of them trying to hide the pregnancy. So not only were they trying to hide the pregnancy, but this is also something that's very common whenever there is physical abuse as well. I'm not sure if there was physical abuse outside of the sexual assault that had been occurring, if there were bruises, if there were black eyes, if there were scars, cuts. But that's something that also tends to happen when there is child abuse, child neglect, and the adults and the people in power are trying to hide what is happening at home, pulling them from sports activities, pulling them from school, pulling them from. Now, sometimes the reason why they've been pulled is because they did report it, or the schools did see it, the therapist did see it, or the teacher did see it, and they reported it. And then the adults in the situation, sometimes they'll completely change schools. They'll change the zip codes, they'll fudge addresses and send them to a completely different school. They'll pull them from extracurricular activities, after school programs. So then they're able to kind of keep things under light, in the darkness, so to speak. So hiding this entire situation from the public eye and from schools, from medical providers, I think is very telling. And for a lot of people, when they hear things like this, sometimes people are like, it doesn't really make sense because she's pregnant. So obviously people are going to find out. But when people are operating at a deficit and they don't have the capacity and they're dealing with some of the other stressors, and again, I always give a disclaimer, this is not an excuse for any of the behavior that's happening. However, when we're dealing with people who are abusive and we look at the entire system that they're dealing with in terms of not having running water, there's likely a lack of food in the house, lack of income coming through the house, the capacity to plan ahead of, well, people are eventually going to find out about this pregnancy at some point in time, probably isn't a factor until it's an actual factor, until the baby is actually there. People in these type of situations are typically just trying to buy time, trying to buy as much time as they possibly can. So keeping everything under wraps, even if they can buy themselves 5 months or 9 months until the baby is here, and then they'll come up with excuses, which I'm going to get into some of the excuses and some of the behavior behind that, because it's something that I've actually seen before. I wish I could say that I had never seen anything like this. And for those of you who are new, I'm a therapist. I'm not necessarily practicing now, but I have most of the people who I've worked with in the past were victims of abuse, and I've worked with children of abuse, and children who are pulled out of homes, put into foster care. And so I have a lot of experience with these type of dynamics. And I wish that this is the first time that I've heard a story like this. This is not the first time I've heard a story like this. So some of these things are not surprising. I've visited homes. I've done in-home visits in homes very similar like this. So I'm very familiar with this world, unfortunately. And so I said all that to say that the systems that the family is operating at, the grandmother, the father, the mother in this situation is based out of their own need for survival as well. And again, that is not an excuse for any of the behavior or anything that's happening. But when you think about the mindset of them just trying to get by, and also while simultaneously trying to cover everything up and trying to keep everything in the dark, you can imagine how hectic and how chaotic that type of home would be, especially when you have multiple different children. We're not just talking about the 11-year-old. I believe they said there were 6 children, which again, I'm going to get into some of that here in a second as well. The second thing that sticks out to me is the enabling in the grandmother and the mother. So the enabling behavior, and we see this, and for those of you who followed me for a while, I talk about enabling a lot. And I'm glad that they're bringing charges, because oftentimes people in situations like this might skate a bit. And I do believe that people who enable this type of behavior also need to be held accountable as well. Even if, and this is where people get upset with me sometimes, even if they are also victims themselves. And where I want to touch on is that they possibly could also be victims. The grandmother and the mother also could be victims of domestic violence. Dustin could possibly be hitting them, beating them, doing financial abuse, could be doing all of those at the same time, which sometimes, and this is where it gets a little fuzzy, it leads to the enabling behavior. So on one hand, you're the victim and you are being abused and you're a part of the abuse. But then on the other hand, you are also a part of the abuse in a different way. You're a part of the abuse by enabling, by keeping your mouth shut, by protecting the person who is abusive. And so therefore it makes you abusive yourself. I wouldn't be surprised if there were any physical abuse that was happening to the children, if they were participating in that as well. And some of this sometimes comes because they are trying to appease to the person who is most abusive, trying to because they're afraid of the consequences, and I use that very loosely. But the retribution of what the retaliation that they might experience if they aren't complicit to his demands and to the way that he treats or mistreats the children, they would be complicit in the sexual acts that he would do towards obviously the 11-year-old, but we don't know, at least I don't know if some of the other children were experiencing sexual abuse as well. The other reason why they would enable a situation like this is that they benefit something from him. So whether that be financial, whether that be drugs, whether that be access to something, access to alcohol, access to, sometimes it's even, I've mentioned this in another case that I did here recently. Sometimes the person who is most abusive might even take care of the kids. And I use that very loosely because of the way that they're treating out. Obviously there's a lot of mistreatment, but in their minds, they're watching them. So it gives them a little bit more freedom to kind of go do what they want in terms of going to hang out, going to do drugs, going to drink alcohol. And so there's likely benefits for them to participate with this, where in their mind, it minimizes the amount of abuse that they are experiencing, but then also there's benefits on the other end, whether that be financial. It doesn't sound like this entire family had a lot of money, but even if it were small amounts of money when someone has no money sometimes seem big. So $20 here and there, $10 here and there. In cases that I've seen and I've worked, it could be a disability check or a social security check. It could be food stamps that they benefit from. So there's a range of benefits that they could have been receiving that would cause them to have a desire to enable, to have them continue to hide and keep him out of trouble. Which brings me to my point, my last point of them blaming another child. I don't know if you picked up on what the grandmother said whenever the reporter saw the grandmother, and she blamed the 11-year-old girl's pregnancy. She was very hesitant about this, but then blamed it on what she called the 12-year-old. Blamed it on, I'm assuming that there's a 12-year-old boy that lives there as well, and blamed it on him. I wish that this was the first time that I ever heard anything like that. It's not. So one of the things I want to point out, and this is something that's it's not talked about, but I wish that it were talked about more often, is that when a step parent is introduced into a home, the likelihood of abusive behavior goes up significantly. You can look this study up, but it goes up significantly. And the reason why I bring that up is that when if that type of abuse is sexual abuse, and if there is another male around the same age child in the home, oftentimes they will get the blame for the father's poor behavior. So there's other cases that I've worked and I've seen where a daughter has gotten pregnant by the stepfather in the situation, and the son ends up taking the rap, so to speak, for the father, to keep the stepfather in these situations out of trouble. Sometimes both the stepson and the stepfather are both abusing and engaging in sexual behavior with the stepdaughter in these type of cases. These type of cases are extremely sad. Now, obviously, this is a more lower economically status type of family, but this can happen even with in a family that has power, a blended family that has power and wealth. And sometimes in those scenarios, it becomes even more sinister because the enabling that you see becomes even more powerful, because now the entire family has a lot more to protect. They have privilege to protect, they have power to protect, they have finances to protect. And so you can see the behavior sometimes becoming even more sinister. So with all that being said, thank you very much. That is all I have for you today. So be sure to like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications so you're notified each and every time I upload a new video. If you are experiencing this, if you are experiencing or have experienced abuse like this in the past and you feel like you need someone to talk to, if you're considering therapy, I have links in the description down below. You can connect with an online therapist through BetterHelp. You'll get 15% off your first month of therapy. They also provide couples therapy as well, and they also provide therapy for teens, for anyone who might have a teenager, or if you are a teenager who might need some help as well. With all that being said, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next episode. You guys have a good one.